Okay. Another kind of obligation rather are joint and solidary obligations. So here we need to distinguish whether an obligation is either joint or solidary. Now, a, jo- uh, in joint obligations, the obligation is to be paid proportionately by debtors or to be demandable proportionately by creditors to each his or in short to each is his own. Dito sa joint or solidary obligations, it presupposes na mayroong two or more debtors, two or more creditors, or both. Ano? So here, uh, in joint obligations, yung obligation is paghahati-hatian ng mga nabayaran ng mga debtors or i-demand ng ilang creditors, maraming creditors ang magde-demand sa either isang tao lang or sa maraming tao. So, kumbaga here, in joint obligations, kanya-kanya. Kanya-kanyang hati doon sa kabuuan ng obligation. Whereas here in solidary obligations, each one of the debtors has the right to render or each one of the creditors has the right to demand the entire compliance of the prestation. Kumbaga yung kung kanina, yung sa joint obligations ay kanya-kanyang bayad ng kanya-kanyang share or kanya-kanyang singil ng kanya-kanyang share. Dito sa solidary obligations, pwedeng i-demand ng isang creditor yung ng kabuuan ng utang sa kahit iisang tao lang or yung isang debtor pwedeng magbayad ng utang ng lahat. Okay? All for one, in this case, all for one for all. Kumbaga, kung marami kayong nangutang, the creditor can just demand fulfillment from one. Kumbaga, isa lang yung sisingilin niya. Pwede niyang singilin yung kabuuan. Unlike sa joint obligation na, kung magkano lang yung hati mo, yun lang yung babayaran mo. Okay. You need to see that distinction, ano? Now, ang rules dito when it comes to joint and solidary obligations is kapag walang batas or kapag walang stipulation sa kontrata or whatever, lahat ng obligation ay kino-consider na joint. Okay. Let's read this. In the absence of law or obligation or stipulation to the contrary, or obligations involving multiple creditors and or multiple debtors are presumed to be joint. Okay. Kung wala na pag-usapan na solidary siya, ang assumption ng batas ay it is joint. Okay? For example, nakalagay sa kontrata na kunwari, marami ang nangutang pero hindi nakalagay sa kontrata na pwedeng singilin ni creditor yung isa lang sa kanila ng buo. Ang presumption doon, ang assumption ng batas ay it is joint. Okay. Pero pag mayroong kontrata at may nakalagay ng mga phrases na ganito, jointly or severally, individually and collectively, to pay each to pay the whole value or I promise to pay pero dalawa ang nakapirma, all of those indicate solidarity. Kumbaga kapag may mga phrases na ganyan doon sa kontrata, that is considered as solidary. Ibig sabihin, kahit isa lang yung singilin ni creditor sa inyong lahat. Okay. Ano ulit yung phrases? Jointly or severally, individually and collectively, to pay for the whole value, I promise to pay, tapos dalawa kayong nagpirma. All of those indicate solidarity. Kumbaga, yung mga yun ang cue nyo para masabi na solidary yung obligation. Now, baka malito kayo dito sa una, yung jointly or severally. Kung jointly or severally, isipin nyo siguro joint kasi nandoon na yung word na joint, ano? Pero yung kapag magkarugtong yung jointly or severally, ibig sabihin nun, solidary siya. Okay? Now, We often hear this, uh, co-maker. Okay. What do we mean when we say co-maker? Kapag co-maker ka, ibig sabihin, solidary yung liability mo with the other debtor. Kumbaga, kunwari, umutang yung kapitbahay mo sa lending. Sabi sa'yo, uy, mag-co-maker ka nga sa akin. What should you do? Well, as a co-maker, kasi, you are solidarily liable. The obligation is solidary. What does it mean when it is solidary? Uh, Ibig sabihin nun, kumbaga, it appears na para kayong solidary debtors. Kumbaga, umutang kayong pareho. Kahit naman in reality, wala kang natanggap na portion ng inutang, pero ang assumption is you are both liable for that amount. At pwedeng singilin ang kahit isa lang sa inyo nung buong amount kasi hindi siya joint, it is solidary. Okay? Dahil solidary siya, ibig sabihin nun ay dahil solidary siya, the creditor can proceed against you or the other nung buong amount. Okay? Hindi mo pwedeng sabihin na, kalahati lang babayaran ko, dalawa naman kami. No. That is solidary. Kahit sino ang pwede niyang singilin sa inyo. And in fact, kahit na hindi pa niya singilin na una, yung nangutang talaga, pwede ka niyang singilin. That's the consequence of being a surety or co-maker. Okay? Meanwhile, yung guarantor, okay, yung co-maker iba kasi sa guarantor eh. Sa guarantor naman, subsidiary yung liability, pero hindi yan madi-discuss dito. But I will discuss it anyway. What do you mean when you say subsidiary ang liability? If you're a guarantor, kumbaga, your assurance is sisingilin muna yung yung nangutang talaga. Okay? Yung nangutang talaga sisingilin muna siya. Pero in case na mag-default siya or in case na hindi siya makapagbayad, you will have to pay. Pero ano pa yon? That's after ma-exhaust nila yung means na masingil siya, mga ganyan. So that means you can also be liable kapag after singilin siya wala talaga silang makita sa kanya. That's the time when sisingilin ka. Pero the case is different when we talk about co-makers. Kapag co-maker, pwede ka nilang singilin immediately kahit hindi pa siya sinisingil. Okay? So that is co-maker and sureties, and that's the distinction between joint and solidary. Again, in joint, kung ilan yung hati mo lang doon sa utang, yun lang ang babayaran mo. In solidary, they can demand from you yung kabuuan ng utang. Okay? In joint obligations, yung creditor can only demand yung portion niya dun sa pinautang. In solidary, yung creditor pwede niyang singilin kahit yung kabuuan ng utang. Okay? So, that's joint and solidary obligations. Okay, finally, we have either divisible or indivisible obligations. Now, baka akala nyo di yung common sense ito na pwedeng ma-divide, pwedeng mahati. So, divisible, indivisible, hindi pwedeng mahati. Well, it's sort of like that, pero there are different, there are some things na hindi masyadong common sense dito about this. So, let's discuss. So, indivisible obligations, yung obligation ay capable of partial performance. Pwede siyang partially i-fulfill. Okay. Yung mga divisible obligations are really rare. For example, kapag utang, mga ganyan, generally, hindi ka pwedeng magbayad ng partial payment kung hindi nyo napag-usapan na pwede mag-partial. Okay? So that's indivisible by contract. Pero in this case, hindi siya ang pinag-usapan natin ay divisible. Yung mga pwedeng partial ang partial ang performance. For example, yung arawan na trabaho, pwedeng bayaran yan ng that is a divisible obligation in a sense na yung bayad accrues on the day, every day. Kumbaga, per araw ang bayaran. Or those paid by percentage of work done. For example, nagpapagawa ka ng bahay, you are required to pay a certain amount. Kung natapos nyo ng 10%, that is divisible. Kung ganun yung pinag-usapan nyo. Kunwari, 10%, babayaran kita. Pag every 10% na matapos mo, babayaran ko yung 10% ng amount. Okay? So that is a divisible obligation. Susceptible of partial performance. Yung mga pwedeng i-perform partially. Yung indivisible naman, yung mga hindi pwedeng i-divide either by law, by nature, or by contract, or by stipulations. Dahil, una, hindi siya divisible by law, for example. Or hindi siya divisible by nature. Or hindi siya divisible because na pag-usapan yung hindi sila divisible. For example, obligation to deliver a live pig. Okay. Yung obligation mo to deliver a live pig is more or less an indivisible obligation. Kasi paano mo naman madi-divide yun? For example, i-divide mo yung baboy. Will that count as a live pig? Siyempre, hindi na yun, no? Hindi na live yun kapag divisible, kapag dinivide mo yung kapag dinivide mo yung obligation. So, in that sense, it is indivisible because of its nature. Kumbaga, kasi kailangan buhay siya, so hindi mo siya pwedeng hatiin. That is indivisible by nature. For example, payment ng renta where it is agreed that installment is not allowed. For example, napag-usapan nyo sa rental agreement na hindi pwedeng partial ang payment. Well, nun, it's indivisible because of your stipulation, because of yung napag-usapan nyo sa contract. Okay? Now, what are indivisible obligations under the law? Well, for example, yung payment, gaya nga sabi ko kanina, payment of debt, kapag nagbayad ka ng utang, unless na pag-agreehan nyo na pwede siyang i-divide, you cannot compel, hindi mo pwedeng pilitin yung isang creditor na tanggapin ang partial payment. Hindi mo pwedeng pilitin na, tanggapin mo na, nagbabayad na ako ng partial, bakit hindi mo tanggapin? Hindi pwede yan. Hindi mo pwedeng pilitin yung tao kung ayaw niyang magpabayad ng partial. That's in the law. Okay? So, again, these are the kinds of obligations. We have the pure obligation, conditional obligation, obligation with a period, alternative obligations, joint and solidary obligations, and divisible and indivisible obligations. Okay? So, by next meeting, we will be discussing yung modes of extinguishing obligations. How do you extinguish your obligations? So, thank you for listening and have a good night.